Hello, everyone. Welcome to this educational program. Today, we are going to talk about how reporters can use the Hinrich-IMD Sustainable Trade Index 2022. I am Patricia Vasconcelos, U.S. correspondent in the United States for SBT Brazilian TV Network, a board member of the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents Association. Today, we have two guests, two panelists. They are here with us, Christos Kabolis and Stephen Olson. Thank you both for joining us. Welcome. And well, I'm going to give briefly what we are going to talk about in this panel, right? Every time we are faced with a study that impacts the life of the global community, it is essential to have the vision and the explanation of high-level professionals who can give us, journalists, direction on how to use this data. So in this educational program, we will provide foreign correspondents with the opportunity to learn from our two experts an overview of exactly what the Sustainable Trade Index is. We are going to talk about policy implications and how reporters can use it. STI is a tool like the World Competitiveness Ranking, which helps shape the way we think about economies. The STI can also highlight forward-looking issues, for instance, how modern-day slavery will affect our approach to supply chains. And finally, this educational program will draw foreign correspondents' attention to some of the great visuals produced by the visual capitalists in their executive summary of the STI, which might be useful to draw upon for their reporting. This educational program is developed in partnership with the Hinrich Foundation, and the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents is solely responsible for the definition and development of this program. We are going to give some background of our guests today. Stephen Olson, he's a senior research fellow at the Hinrich Foundation. Over the course of his more than 30-year international career, Olson has lived and worked in Asia, the Middle East, and also United States, holding senior executive positions in the private sector, international organizations, government, and academia. He began his career here in Washington, D.C., where I am now, as a U.S. trade negotiator, serving as a member of the U.S. negotiation team during NAFTA and the U.S.-Canada FTA. He went on to serve as president on the Pacific Basin Economic Council in Hong Kong. He also became the vice chairman at the Cairo-based RTOC Group for Investment and Development. He has also held visiting professor positions at various universities. In his current position at Hinrich Foundation, Mr. Olson conducts analysis and research on global trade and investment issues, including U.S.-China relations, the global trade architecture, and sustainable trade. Also here with us today, we have Dr. Christos Kabolis. He is the chief economist and head of the operations at the IMD World Competitiveness Center, where he manages the 5 annual rankings related to competitiveness of 65 economies around the world and their performance with respect to digital and talent dimensions, Smart City Index, and most recently, the Sustainable Trade Index. He's also an adjunct professor of economics and competitiveness at IMD. Before joining IMD, Christos was an associate professor of economics and finance Alba Graduate Business School at the American College of Greece. He was the executive director of the International Center for Finance at Yale School of Management from 2002 to 2004, where he is now research fellow. From 1997 to 2002, he was lecturer of economics at Yale University, where he also served as dean of Jonathan Edwards College. Christos has also taught at the University of California at Santa Barbara and the University of North Carolina, Kenan Flagler Business School. Christos holds a BA from the University of Athens. MA from the California State University, Long Beach, and a PhD in economics from the University of California at Santa Barbara. He has published in the Review of Financial Studies, Journal of Law and Economics, and Journal of Banking and Finance, among others. Christos is also the recipient of the inaugural Jaime Fernandez de Araoz Award in Corporate Finance. So after this brief introduction, I'm going to open for your presentations. Dr. Christos Kabolis, again, thank you very much for joining us today. We are ready to listen to you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for this extensive and very nice introduction. I'm joining you from Lausanne, Switzerland, right now. So for me, it's late afternoon. For my colleague in Bangkok, of course, a little bit later at night. But we are truly global right now. And I would like to thank also Thanos, who sent the initial invitation, the very kind invitation. Of course, the Heinrich Foundation, who has established this very interesting series of lectures. When I was speaking with Steve, I thought that's a very nice way of exchanging ideas, discussing, and actually making us think about issues that maybe have not come from an academic point of view in our minds immediately. So I'm very, very happy and pleased to be here. What we plan to do with Steve is actually, I will speak a little bit and tell you what exactly we try to do with sustainable trade, with the Sustainable Trade Index. And we'll go through some of the components of the index. And then I will pass the baton to Steve, who's gonna speak about the index from a different perspective, from the perspective on how it can be approached. So Sustainable Trade Index was launched as a collaborative work between the Heinrich Foundation and the IMD, the World Competitiveness Center, in November of 2022. This is the fourth edition, so to speak. There have been 3 other editions before that they were biannual. What we try to do here is essentially to measure the readiness and capacity of 30 economies to participate in the global trading system, but participate in a manner that supports the long-term objectives of economic growth, of societal development, and of environmental protection. So just to get a visual idea of what is the area that we cover, you see that essentially we cover 30 economies in the South Asian part and the Oceania. These are 30 economies that are members of APEC, of RCEP, and of the most recent CPTPP agreement. And you get a glimpse of the ranking that we provide. What we have here is the countries that come. The first is New Zealand, then we have UK, which is included because it applies to be part of the CPTPP arrangement. And the rest of the 28 countries, we will see some of them in different contexts, just to bring you visually what exactly we try to do. This is a very important part of the world, actually, globally. The 30 countries that we study capture about 69% of the global GDP and about 63% of the global population, the share of the global population. So we're discussing about a very big component of the global economy and the global demographics. And it consists of countries that are both developed economies and developing economies, which makes our exercise even more interesting. What we do is we have gathered 70 different criteria, and we included these 70 criteria in 3 different pillars. So the plan is now to go through these pillars and understand how we come up with these numbers, why New Zealand is #1 and why Australia is #6. So the first pillar that we study is the economic pillar. And the economic pillar measures the ability of an economy to promote economic growth through international trade. And this should be, in some respect, how we link the economy, a particular economy, with a trade system. The criteria that we try to, that we employ here are related to either the economy, like inflation, like investments, growth in the labor force, growth in GDP, but at the same time, we take into consideration the trading system. So we study tariff barriers, we study non-tariff barriers, we study concentration of goods or concentration of countries that are exporting these economies. We study trade liberalization of the different economies, and we try to combine these things. And when we do, we find the ranking that you see on the screen. You see me turning in one way, because here is the screen that you see on your screens. And you see that what we have here is, in the economic pillar, Hong Kong and Singapore dominate this pillar, while then follow South Korea, United States, different economies. We see some small economies in the lower parts of the ranking. Myanmar be the lowest. From that, at least at this point of our discussion, what I would suggest we have in mind is what makes these countries stand out. What makes Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea stand out? And with our what our analysis shows is that essentially what we have is that technological innovation is a component that it is very, very important for the countries that are ranking very high. The countries that are ranking very high are also having robust macroeconomic fundamentals. And of course, they have a very open trading environment. You may ask, why technological innovation? And the reason for that is because technological innovation is the basis for high value exports. So in order to produce the high value products, we need the technological innovations. And in some ways, economies that move from being the low cost providers and moving forward to a more advanced and complicated economies need the backup of the technological innovation. So this is what we get from the economic pillar. And the second pillar that we study is the societal pillar. So the societal pillar captures the social factors that contribute to an economy's capacity to trade over the long period of time. And in trading over the long period of time, essentially, we try to capture 2 things. We try to capture the development of human capital, which is a very, very important component. And also we try to capture whether the public supports the trade. We are going through a period of time where we see that there is a lot of reaction. We are speaking about the perils of globalization. We see different political entities trying to take a distance from this process of integration through trade, among other things. What we like is to capture that. How do we do that? Well, with respect to the development of human capital, we measure things like educational attainment. We measure things like good health. This is life expectancy at birth, labor standards. With respect to public support of trade, we measure things like income inequality or political stability. As a component that we are very, very proud that we managed to include the presence of modern slavery and how much modern slavery is included in the goods traded. In this pillar, the countries that dominate are two small economies, small with respect to population, New Zealand, Canada, and then Australia, UK. And as we go down, we see again countries that essentially are like Myanmar, India, and Pakistan have the three last positions. What are the areas where the countries that perform very well actually have in common? And if we think about that, we see that these countries have a very good health infrastructure. It is an educated population. There is social mobility. And of course, these governments manage to address the issues of related to modern slavery, child labor, forced labor, human trafficking. And we move in the third pillar. The third pillar is the environmental pillar. And in the environmental pillar, essentially what we try to capture is the ability, the extent to which an economy is engaging in environmentally sustainable trade. How can we think about that? Well, before we were discussing about the development of human capital. Here, what we see and how we perceive is to develop the environmental capital of a country now and for the future, because these are investments that one takes now, and the returns of these investments will come after a few years. How do we measure these things? How do we measure the now component? We measure the now component by taking into consideration the quality of air, the quality of water, the deforestation ratio that a country has. How do we measure the future? Well, by trying to establish what kind of environmental standards a country has, to see what exactly is going on with the carbon emissions of a particular economy, and to see the share of natural resources that are traded. So in some ways, what we try to capture is whether economies, in some respect, take into consideration the negative externalities that may come from the production of a particular good to the trading of this particular good. The whole ranking, and I'm just placing this to see. I show you something in the very, very beginning. Essentially, it is what we find, and I put that here just to take a look before I pass the microphone to my colleague Steve. Thank you very, very much for the moment, and I'm looking forward to hear Steve and hear your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christos Kabolis. We are going to analyze more all graphics that you just showed to us. Stephen Olson, welcome, and we are glad to hear you. Stephen, a Senior Research Fellow at the Heinrich Foundation. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Patricia, very much, and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, or good evening, as the case might be. On behalf of the Heinrich Foundation, a very big thank you to the organizers for putting together today's event. It's a real pleasure for us to be here. Now that Christos has provided us with such a clear overview of exactly what the STI is all about, what I'd like to do is take just a few minutes and unpack a bit how you as working journalists might find the STI useful. Now, and that will also give me an opportunity to highlight some of the key policy takeaways that I think you might also find interesting from the STI. Now, I think the first thing I draw your attention to on the STI is that it provides you with a fairly unique prism or a unique lens to assess in a much more holistic way how different countries are approaching international trade. We're not just looking at the economic aspects, which countries are getting rich through international trade, but we're also looking at the societal and environmental aspects of the way that they engage in international trade. And that allows us to make some preliminary conclusions about the extent to which these countries are engaging in trade in a way that will be sustainable over the longer term. And so I think as you get a chance to take a look at the STI, walk through it, I think you're going to find a number of story angles that are quite interesting, and perhaps more importantly, are not getting the attention that they probably should be. And I want to illustrate that by drawing your attention to just a couple of things in particular. Now, one thing you might have noticed is that to a certain extent, our index tracks with wealth. So you have the richer countries towards the top of the index, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and you have some of the poorer countries towards the bottom of the country, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Pakistan, etc. But one thing that we find very interesting is to look at those countries that are either overperforming or underperforming their income level. So, for example, one of the most noteworthy underperformers is the United States of America. The US ranks number 2 in terms of per capita GDP. However, on the STI, the US ranks number 9. So we would consider that to be an underperformance in terms of its, an underperformance of 7 spots in terms of its income level. Now, this isn't going to come as a tremendous shock to any of you, but one of the primary reasons for this US underperformance is because of the large number of tariff and non-tariff measures that the United States has put in place in recent years. So if the United States was interested in thinking about engaging in trade in a more sustainable way, some of those tariff and non-tariff barriers would be a good place to start. Now let's take a look at the other end of the spectrum in a country that we consider to be an overperformer on the index. And one of the economies that really jumps out at us there is the Philippines. The Philippines overperformed its income level by, I think, 11 or 12 spots. So what is the Philippines doing so well? Well, a big part of that overperformance is driven by a very strong performance on the environmental pillar. The Philippines scored number 5 on the environmental pillar as a result of a number of factors, including things like low transfer emissions in trade. Basically, that means its exports are not quote unquote dirty. And the Philippines also adheres to high levels of environmental standards in the different trade agreements that it is a party to. So I think this whole question of which economies are either punching above their weight or punching below their weight, and what are the reasons for that, I think provides a number of interesting angles that could be unpacked. The second thing that I would draw your attention to in terms of how you could actually use the STI is that it provides an interesting framework for thinking about future-oriented issues and issues that sometimes don't enter the trade discussion to the extent that they probably should be. Now, this gives me an opportunity to say a few words about one thing that really jumped out at me from this year's index as being quite important, and I think it might be important to you as well. And that is the role of, if not the complicity of, large developed countries in modern day slavery. Now, by and large, most of the large developed economies that we looked at maintain fairly high labor standards within their own borders. Unfortunately, this was undercut by the fact that many of these same economies have a propensity to import products that are at a risk of being produced by modern day slavery. So although they might not be tolerating modern day slavery within their own borders, they're a part of this big aggregate global demand, which is allowing a modern day slavery to thrive. So a real important issue, and one that perhaps hasn't been front and center in the discussions as much as it should be. Another sort of forward-looking issue, and one that doesn't come up as much as it probably should in the trade discussion, that I'd like to draw your attention to, is this whole issue of life expectancy, the quality of how well countries take care of their people, and in particular, the disturbing decline in life expectancy we're seeing in some countries. Now, look, of course, you don't have to point out to me, well, Steve, there was just this thing called the coronavirus pandemic for the last 3 years, and that certainly caused a tremendous deal, a very high level of deaths, and would impact this life expectancy. That's certainly the case. However, if you look at an economy like the United States, the coronavirus pandemic is not the entire explanation for this decline in life expectancy that we're seeing. Now, most, if not all of you are living in the United States, so you probably see this up close and personal to a greater extent than I do. But the fentanyl crisis in the United States and overdose deaths from fentanyl has really contributed to this decline in life expectancy. Excuse me one moment. We have, in addition to the fentanyl overdoses, we have these what are referred to as deaths of despair, and also an alarming rise in the suicide levels, particularly among some age groups. So this question of life expectancy, it's important to think about that in terms of the trade discussion and the sustainability of trade over time. If countries are experiencing declining life expectancy, and the healthcare system doesn't seem adequate to address some of these concerns, what does that suggest about the ability of these countries to engage in trade successfully and sustainably over the longer term? So I think there's some interesting forward-looking issues that are not as much a part of the trade discussion as they probably should be. Another specific takeaway from the index that I wanted to draw your attention to was a disturbing increase in tariff and non-tariff barriers. Now, this increase in trade restrictions is both a reflection of and a contributor to the dysfunction that we're seeing in the global trade system. Now, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, unfortunately, is basically dead in the water. One of the primary roles of the WTO is to act as sort of a global trade referee, but as a result of an impasse over appellate body judges, that function has more or less been derailed. Now, I would hasten to add, however, though, that even if we could wave a magic wand, and even if we could resolve the impasse over the judges and restore the dispute settlement function tomorrow, in my personal judgment, I still don't think that the WTO could act as an effective global trade referee, because the global trade rule book it is trying to enforce is really hopelessly out of date. And the ability of the WTO to negotiate new trade rules, up-to-date trade rules, or to negotiate more trade opening agreements, again, has almost been entirely derailed by the divisiveness, by the factions within the WTO membership, which makes it impossible, seemingly at least, to agree on anything of consequence. As a reminder, the WTO acts on the basis of consensus for all major decisions. So with the WTO and with it global trade governance really struggling, we're faced with the prospects that we might be tending back into the direction of much more of a law of the jungle approach to international trade. Now, I'd remind everybody that so much of the post-World War II boom in international trade that we saw and the incredible economic development benefits that so many countries around the world experienced as a result of international trade were all based on the fact that we had a stable, rules-based global trading system. And if that stable, rules-based global trade system is now on the ropes, is now really struggling to function effectively, that's really going to impact our ability to engage in the long term over sustainable trade. So the sustainable trade discussion is really indivisible from the discussion about getting the WTO back on track. One last thing I'll mention just very briefly, one last thing I want to draw your attention to in the STI is the fact that we've got some great graphics. We engaged a firm that I think at least some of you will be familiar with, Visual Capitalist, based in Vancouver. They produced some very catchy, some very useful graphics, which tease out some of the stories from the STI. I think it might be useful for you to take a look at it for your own edification. And if you can use it in any stories, certainly please feel free to go ahead and do so. The last thought that I'll leave you with is that I want to be very clear about one thing. We did not create the Sustainable Trade Index because we think that we have all the answers when it comes to sustainable trade. And in fact, we're quite sure that we do not have all the answers when it comes to sustainable trade. Our real objective was to engage in dialogue, discussion, and to highlight some of these issues related to sustainable trade that are not getting the attention we think that they deserve. So we certainly invite all of you and hope that all of you will be part of this discussion moving forward. I think I'll draw my comments to a close there, and I'll look forward to our discussion and Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen and Christos, too, for your both explanations. Stephen, let's start our section of questions and answers. I would like to start with a thought you just dropped there when you said about the WTO, right, that cannot be a global referee with everything that is happening nowadays, and that now what we see in this world, it's like the law of the jungle. How can all of this affect the Sustainable Trade Index? You also said that the STI, it's a open book for engagement and talking among countries, right? So the question is how this law of jungle, if the WTO cannot be used as a global referee, how countries can engage and how this affect the Sustainable Trade Index that we are talking here today?
Yeah. Well, look, thank you very much. And that's really the $64,000 question of the moment. For whatever it's worth, I've been involved in international trade for more than 30 years now, starting my career as a trade negotiator back in the 1980s. I never would have imagined back then that we would have arrived at the point that we're at now. I mean, this 75-year rules-based post-war global trade system that we put in place, maybe some people understand it, maybe some people don't, but is really teetering and is really on the brink. And I think we're at an important inflection point. And I think that system is in the process of passing away. Now, so what's next? I think it's hard for us to see precisely where we're headed, but the one thing that I would say with greater confidence is that as the multilateral trade governance system continues to break down, I think we're headed for greater fragmentation. And I think the fragmentation, because of rising geopolitical strains and tensions, I think the fragmentation is going to be oriented much more on the basis of geopolitical commonality, common philosophies on governance, and other things rather than economic efficiencies. Keep in mind, our trading relationships for the past 3/4 of a century have largely been built on and dictated by economic efficiencies. If we're now moving into an era where we're saying, well, we want to do friendshoring, and we want to trade with countries who think like us, act like us, have the same geopolitical interests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then one of the things that gets sacrificed is economic efficiencies. So I think that old system that has served us very well for 3/4 of a century is passing away. I think we're clearly moving towards a much more fragmented trade system, a trade system where geopolitical considerations become much more important. And I think we're really going to give up some economic efficiencies. And I think this all bodes very poorly. It's a great concern for us from the point of view of sustainable trade, because as I say, we really need that stable rules-based system, and we need a global system. In order for trade to be truly sustainable, it needs to be a global system, not this fragmented system that unfortunately we seem to be headed towards.
Thank you very much. So we have a fragmented system, and we also have countries that they have completely different realities. So Christos, let's talk about the ranking. Is it true to say that Asia and Oceania are in a better place than the rest of the world regarding sustainable trade? Africa, for example, is not in the ranking, if I am correct. What is lacking there?
You're absolutely correct, Patricia. Thank you for the question. It's true that at least at the moment, we continue a tradition for this ranking, and we are focusing in the region of Southeast Asia and Oceania. And essentially, we try to capture what exactly we would like to understand what is going on with these 30 countries. We don't have information about Africa, the continent of Africa that you said, despite the fact that it is a continent of tremendous wealth of resources. It is a continent which has a very large number of young labor force. It will be the one who will provide essentially the needed spark and enthusiasm in the labor force in all the other continents. And there are the problems that we were saying before about political stability, about whether, we see residents of a country to feel a little bit uneasy with quote unquote globalization and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, Africa holds this particular very important assets. I don't necessarily feel that they are very much behind. I think over there, a very important point that needs to be brought is how they will be able to contribute in the easing of climate damage, but at the same time, not be called to undertake a huge amount of cost for something that they were not at all involved in producing it. So, and this was one of the very important issues of COP27 back in November. And I think this is one of the big issues there. Okay.
Continuing with you, Stephen said that regarding the United States, that it's in the 9th position in this ranking, that one of the reasons for the underperformance is the number of tariffs. Could you explain for us, foreign journalists, better in a practical way, why and how this amount of tariffs impact the development of the United States regarding trade?
Of course. Essentially, I mean, taking from what Steve was saying before about the whole trading system, the global trading system, we saw that after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a tremendous increase of openness. We as a global community, we became more prone to integrate both with respect to the move of goods and services, with respect of the move of people, but very, very importantly, with respect of the moving of capital. And this created an unbelievable generation of wealth. And in fact, this was what was a driving force behind the move of a very big part of population above the poverty line. Take China, for instance. In order to do that, a major component was the trade. And it managed to do that because there were less and less tariffs, that is, less and less barriers for goods to move around, goods and services. Of course, as we know, history moves in waves, and therefore there is some reconsideration. There are some issues that came up from this tremendous openness. One important fact that comes in mind is this unequal distribution of all the wealth that was generated. And of course, the efficiency that Steve very correctly was speaking before led in different countries, United States, to lose a number of labor positions, which were moved in places that, at least at the time, could produce the same things in the same quality much cheaper. So this is the economic efficiency that was there. At a particular point, we see a change in the mind of people. They start reconsidering these issues. And the outcome of this reconsideration was essentially the beginning of the trade war between China and United States. And in that particular point, there was the introduction of all the additional tariffs in the American economy, which in essence was trying to do two things. The one was to not allow a lot of US income to go abroad. And the other thing was a hope that some of these products, since they're so expensive, can be produced within the American soil.
Stephen, yes, I think it's clear. If we continue in this theme, what is the way you believe that for United States to get a better performance in this index?
So as Steve said, I think we need to reconsider what exactly is going on with tariffs. Now, this is, of course, easier to say than done, because when we just touch upon one issue, it may seem in the company of the three of us, where we have this very nice discussion, something very easy, but we know for a fact that it is not. And one issue that was introduced in the last few years, and it became the most important issue last year, was the reintroduction, if you want, of the geopolitical risk. One of the reasons why this efficiency, the economic efficiency, was enjoyed was because essentially the geopolitical risk was almost negligible, and therefore the cost for the geopolitical risk was almost equal to zero. And that's why we saw many companies moving at once around the globe. Now, where there is a new reality, which of course, COVID made us take a step back and start reconsidering with all the disruptions in the supply chains, in the international supply chains. And then the war in Ukraine, when Russia actually expanded, started the war in Ukraine, which meant that we have a very increase in issues related with commodities and energy. make everybody reconsider, every country reconsidering these particular aspects. So when you say, what do we do from now? I think we know the end point. The end point is to make agreements that will be more broader in scope than possibly were before. We have some very good regional such agreements, right? NAFTA is in United States, the European Union serves something like that. RCEP is in Asia. So we do have these. The issue, I think, and it manifested itself in the most recent Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity discussion that started last year between United States and several countries in Southeast Asia, where essentially you see that this is not a trade agreement, of course, in any way, but it's really a discussion, a framework that introduces many of the components that Steve and I were discussing and we try to formulate in the Sustainable Trade Index. It discusses about fair trade, it discusses about resilient trade, sustainable that is. It discusses about resilient supply chains, anti-corruption, clean energy. And these are components where the countries come and try to see how far they can go. And I think this is probably the way, one path that we can move forward.
Okay. Stephen, a question
Steve,
for you.
I don't know whether Steve would like to, because when usually we are discussing, he always has
for the other person to comment.
Funny you should ask, Christos. Actually, I did. If I could tack one thing on to Christos' insightful comments, and just when we think about the performance of the United States and STI and looking forward, let me flag a couple of issues that I think are going to be really interesting to keep our eye on and see how it plays out, just in terms of the STI and more broadly in terms of where our global economy and where our global trading system is going. And I think it's this really remarkable, fairly bold step that the Biden administration has made into industrial policy. I think we're really going to need a number of years to kind of, as that really hits the ground, becomes implemented. I think we're really going to need to take some time to impact fully how that's going to impact the global trade system, global trade relationships, and all of the issues that we talk about under the Sustainable Trade Index and the rankings in the Sustainable Trade Index. Anytime a country unveils that level of industrial policy, and particularly that level of subsidization, it's going to introduce distortions into the global trading system. So then you've got one wave of distortions which you've got to assess. But then in the political context, you've got to understand there will always be another shoe to drop. So the United States is making this foray into industrial policy, and now other countries around the world, the European Union, are looking at themselves and saying, well, how do we feel about this? Does this mean we need to up our game? What is the global trading system? What is the global economy? What is sustainable trade going to look like if countries now feel increasing pressure to get into the industrial policy game, to get into this massive subsidization game? What does that do to the economic efficiencies that we've all benefited from as a result of an open trade system and a trade system that was dictated largely by market forces? We're moving into an era now where market forces aren't the primary determinant of trade flows. That's incorrect to say, aren't the sole determinant of trade flows to the extent they had been in the past. Now government fiat and government checkbooks are getting into the game. So I'd say we've really got to keep a close eye on that one. The second issue I draw people's attention to, and this illustrates a challenge of sustainable trade because it's not easy. So we've arrived at a point now where there's a global recognition of the urgency of addressing climate change and environmental issues. So we recognize we've got to increase the uptake of renewable energy sources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that runs the risk, at least, of opening this whole Pandora's box of green protectionism, because we want to develop renewable sources of energy, but we want to develop our own sources of renewable energy. We don't want to import them from you. And so charges and countercharges, is your policy really about the environment, or is your policy really about protectionism? That becomes a real complication for us when we think about sustainable trade. And again, brings us back to, this whole subsidization and industrial policy game, because part of what the Biden administration is doing under the so-called Inflation Reduction Act is to really massively subsidize electric vehicles and other sources of alternative energy. So I think we're on the cusp of some really important game changes rippling through the system. And so we're just going to really have to be very vigilant to see exactly how it plays out and the implications, both for the global trading system and how it becomes reflected year after year in our Sustainable Trade Index.
Right. And we want to talk about foreign investors. We have a question here about this. The text says that Hong Kong, for example, did so well because it is financial attractive for foreign investors. Starting with Stephen now, what do you think that can make a country attractive for foreign investors? Practical examples, if you could help us with that.
There are a couple of things that seem to cut across the countries or the economies that do well in attracting foreign investment. Certainly, near the top of the list, we've got to put stable rule of law. We've got to put low levels of corruption. We've got to put political stability. If you're concerned about what the status is of the government or things like that, that's not a place where private companies look to put their money. And then, of course, sound economic fundamentals, as well as an openness to trade. These are typically some of the criteria that we see that is common to those countries that seem to do well with FDI. Now, unfortunately, we're seeing a disturbing trend now where more and more countries, for geopolitical or for other reasons, are instituting foreign investment reviews. And so there's more screening there's more screening mechanisms put in place. There's more scrutiny of this investment. So that's going to be an important thing for us to keep our eye on moving forward.
Christos, anything to add regarding this topic, foreign investment?
I totally agree with Steve. I think in general, when we are thinking about investors, they assume a very high level of risk. Whatever makes this risk a little bit more manageable, that is, whenever you look forward and part of your uncertainty is more or less constant, then this helps an investor to feel much more comfortable in a particular country. Political stability, rule of law, number one, corruption. These are fundamental components that essentially create an environment where a potential investor, the only thing that he would have to think about is what exactly is going on with the particular investment, and not necessarily that much with the big environment of where this investment takes place.
Christos, still for you, we have three pillars here, right, for reference for this index. The one related to society, the text says that you measure, for example, educational achievement, labor mobility, and social mobility. Can you explain those concepts?
Yes, of course. Social mobility essentially is a component where the labor, people in a particular country can actually feel that they can move socially from one stage to another. Labor mobility allows you to move, and in fact, not only move within your own country, but actually we have right now an international talent pool that many countries actually try to provide a number of different things in addition to salaries in order to make sure that they, as economies, they're appealing to the international talent pool. And we see that now, especially after COVID, where remote working has become part of our lives. So these are the components over there about mobility. Did you mention another one that I may have overlooked?
Let me take a look here. We saw labor mobility, social mobility.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is the difference, right?
Okay. So is it correct to say that if we look the countries that they are in a better position in the ranking, New Zealand, United Kingdom, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, Australia, they're all doing good in those topics?
Yes, the quick answer is yes. Now, one of the things that we strongly feel when we created the Sustainable Trade Index is what we provide is the capacity to decision makers, both public and private sector decision makers, to actually be able to use a benchmark, a best practice, and find out what exactly is going on between their own position and the position of the country that they feel it is a best practice country for them to go. And then as soon as they find that, they can build a strategy that can take them from the position that they are now to maybe improve upon certain issues. Essentially, what we are providing with a Sustainable Trade Index is the ability of a decision maker to see what are the strengths of a particular economy and what are the areas of improvement.
Let's talk about there is a question here about places where the population faces war or internal violence, and how those realities impact sustainability in not only in those countries but in the world itself. So Christos, as you were already with us, if you want to start, and then we go to Stephen.
Yes, of course. This is a tremendously difficult question because it's not only about economic issues, but it is also issues about the society in general and humanitarian things. When there is a conflict and when there is a war, essentially most of the standards of living, the quality of life completely changes. So it is disrupted in the most brutal way. And therefore, we cannot speak in the same way that we are addressing here countries and speak about these very tense issues. If we speak about periods of polarization and maybe internal violence, then I think that the very first set of rules and policies that they should come is how they can remove this internal violence. And again, obviously, in order to exist this, it is not an easy thing. So you cannot go and say, okay, let's solve the issue in Syria right now. We know that it's extremely complicated and very difficult to approach. But I think that if we can think, as Steve said before, what are in the forefront of the solution package, I think that, and I will say that in all the issues that Steve and I discussed, and Steve mentioned that in passing in his comments, is trust. If we don't have trust, then it's very difficult to have an agreement in trade. It's very difficult to have a resilient and long-term built relationship. It's very difficult to undertake different risky endeavors. So in this particular situation, my thinking, and I thinking loudly now, is how you can bring trust back in the table.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So giving you the word, and is still in the same topic, especially because you mentioned when you started your presentation about life expectancy and how this affects this index, right? So with everything that is happening in different countries, and especially in Ukraine, that is something that affects the world globally. Can we face some changes in the index of this year, 2023?
Well, yeah, look, I think this issue of warfare is something that is going to ripple throughout our index in a lot of important ways. So just to follow up on a couple of points that Christos made, one of the realities that we're seeing in the current day now is the increasing use of economic warfare to follow actual military warfare. And what this frequently means then is disengaging what is perceived to be an offending party from the global trade system, from the global economic system, the implications that that has for our global trade system, the extent to which that damages the whole notion of a sustainable global trade system is very real. And then, you know, perhaps most tragically, just the dislocation that conflict can have on the physical movement of goods, and in particular, critical goods. So, you know, we've all read all of these heartrending stories about the different food shortages, acute food shortages, that different countries in the world are suffering as a result of the disruption in the Black Sea from the, you know, one of the bread baskets of the world. So, you know, this whole issue of warfare, I think, unfortunately, is going to be profoundly reflected in negative ways in our index, and will really batter the promulgation of a more sustainable global trade system, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. You also said about the complicity of some developed countries with modern day slavery. Could you develop a little bit more this thought or this concept, explaining how this affects the index? And
yeah, I think we're all happy to see countries that maintain high levels of labor standards within their own borders, and that really have a very low tolerance level for modern day slavery within their own border. That's great. But I think now we've really got to highlight the need for these same countries to say, well, that's great, but it's not enough, because you've really got to look at your import profile. And if you are importing a significant number of products that are in all probability being produced by modern day slavery, then your hands are just as dirty as anyone else's here. So I think you know, we really need to highlight these issues. I think this is a great opportunity where, you know, the value of social media can come in to make consumers more aware of the impact that some of their purchasing choices have on labor conditions on the other side of the world. But one of the unique things of our index is to really capture both sides of this coin. And so that it's not just the countries that actually have modern day slavery within their own borders that are see their scores suffer as a result, excuse me, it's also the countries that might not have modern day slavery within their own borders, but a propensity to import those products. So we hope that's a real useful learning, a real important takeaway from the index, that it takes two to tango, And even if you're very tough on modern day slavery within your own borders, you undercut that completely if you permit the importation of those products. So let's hope that that's a message from the index that really gets out there and resonates.
Christos, anything to add regarding this? Yeah.
Yes, I would like to just provide a graph to show what exactly Steve was saying. And give me a minute. I'm a little bit of a novice here.
Sure. It's there.
So this is a graph. Let me explain a little bit the axis, and you will see what was the point that Steve so eloquently was making. In the vertical axis, what we have is we measure the criterion, which is imports of goods at risk of modern slavery. So this is just imports, not exports, imports, right? And in the horizontal axis, we just provide the overall ranking of the Sustainable Trade Index. So what we have here, these are countries like United Kingdom, Japan, Hong Kong, United States is here, South Korea, New Zealand, which is #1, right? And essentially, Steve says, what this reveals, because it's a negative relationship, and that means that the countries actually that perform very, very well in the total ranking are also the countries that actually perform poorly when we try to measure imports of goods that have the risk of modern slavery. So here's what Steve said, that these countries essentially, we know that this is something that they will never tolerate knowledgeably in their own territory. And also, they don't want this to exist. Nevertheless, it seems that the countries these countries, they do not have yet mechanisms who can allow them to see what exactly is going on. On the other hand, what we have here is we have countries that are ranked very low in our index, like Bangladesh, Myanmar, Brunei, Laos, and so on and so forth. And of course, these countries have very, very little risk of importing goods at the risk of modern slavery. On the other hand, and this is what Steve was saying, these are the countries that are producing these goods most of the times that go to the highly ranked economies. And that's why the statement we need to dangle, because it is not only what these countries are doing that are producing the goods at risk of modern slavery, but it's also these countries that are importing these goods. And therefore, we have to find a mechanism to address this issue.
Okay, very clear. Christos, there's someone asking if you can explain the infographics by visual capitalist in a broadly way.
Which infographic?
Which has to do with tariffs in force, the number of harmful tariffs. We already talked about this, about how US is underperforming regarding the number of tariffs. And so in this graphic, we have US in the first place, and then India, Russia in the third place, and Japan in the fourth place.
Correct, correct. I don't have this particular graph, but I can explain
Sure.
what is going on. In essence, when we see introduction of tariffs, essentially what is going on is that the imports and the exports, the prices of the importing goods and the exporting goods are not actually the ones that are provided by the market, but they are disturbed by the tariff, the additional tax that it is levied, which means that the price of that the consumers are facing of a good that it is under tariff is much higher than before, and therefore there will be fewer people who will buy that, and the country will make fewer imports. The same is true for the exporting country, because now that the exporting country that is facing the tariff, obviously they're not going to be able to charge the price that incorporates the tariff as well. And therefore what we see is we see a distortion in the import-export mechanism. This affects the economic pillar. Why? Because essentially what we try to measure the tendency of how an economy flourishes, prospects, develops, especially through trade. So if the trade is affected, of course, the economic growth is going to be affected as well.
Perfect.
Does it make sense?
Yes, completely. Thank you very much. Stephen, do you want to add anything regarding? Okay, we are going to 1 hour and 10 minutes of our educational program, so we are walking towards the conclusion. We have here journalists, a lot of information, very helpful to help us in our profession. Christos, what comes next? How do you believe that this index can help the civil society, that include us journalists, right, and also governments, to improve its policies?
I think that what comes next is essentially for us to see this year. It will be the second edition of this particular setup of countries and criteria, at least for the moment. We need to discuss about that. And we will see how this index evolves, what exactly is happening with the economies, and knowing all the current affairs, what Steve was saying before, we will be able to explain some of the analysis that we have. We rely a lot on how these issues will be communicated, not because we know that we are absolutely right, but because we believe, as Steve said before, I think I want to emphasize that, but because we feel that this is an area that needs a very dynamic public discussion. Unless we start discussing about the issues, we are not going to be able to move forward. What we feel we do is, when you have a problem, the first step in order to start solving the problem is to be aware that the problem exists. I have to say that personally, even though I was reading about modern slavery, I never felt that it will be such a very big issue in a potential index, which means that awareness brings the topics in the table, and then solutions may come. So we rely a lot in your expertise as journalists, in your quality of bringing this information forward. And we hope that this ranking will be more and more in the minds of decision makers.
Definitely. Thank you very much for your explanation, for seeing our role in society like this. Now, speaking in behalf of my colleagues, journalists. Thank you very much.
One quick word, if I may. We really are counting on our friends in the media. You know, the messages contained in here are so important, and yet they don't get the recognition, they don't get the discussion, they don't get the attention of policymakers they deserve. So we really hope and really encourage our friends in the media can help us promote the discussion of some of these challenging and difficult sustainable trade issues moving forward. We hope when we request.
Thank you very much, Stephen Olson. Thank you very much, Dr. Christos Kabolis, for your time that you both spent here with us. And I wish you both a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thanks,
It was
everyone.
really a pleasure. I didn't realize that the time passed, but it was tremendously pleasure.
Thank you.
so
Thank you
much.
very, very much. This educational program. Yes, yes, Stephen.
An open invitation, any of your colleagues, please feel free to contact us for any follow-up. We're always available and eager to work with our friends in the media.
Oh, this is awesome. We are going to put then all contact information in our page when this program it's going to be available as well online for sure.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So this educational program it was broadcasted live, but we are always also going to put all the content online. We spoke today about how reporters can use the Hinrich-IMD Sustainable Trade Index 2022. This educational program is developed in partnership with Hinrich Foundation, and the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents is solely responsible for the definition and development of this program. Thank you very much of all colleagues, journalists who are here with us today joining this program. See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.